During the Second World War, there were a huge amount of war crimes committed by different armies, and many of these went unpunished after the end of the conflict. Different trials were held across Europe to bring the perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity to justice, but there were many massacres that went unpunished. There was one massacre which took place on the 27th of May 1940 during the Battle of France, when the British Expeditionary Force were trying to retreat to get back to Dunkirk to await evacuation. The Paradis Massacre took place, in which 97 British soldiers were killed, being mown down by machine gun fire near a barn. There were only 2 survivors, and it was the German 14th Company SS Division Totenkopf, under the command of Fritz Nerklein, who were the perpetrators. Join us today as we look at the brutal executions of the Paradis Massacre. Remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. The Battle of France was the SS Division Totenkopf's first major engagement of the Second World War. The unit were involved in conducting operations against the Allies to the north and east of Cambrai. They were tasked with rounding up prisoners and then took 16,000 in total in France. They did have a reputation for execution and murder, as 200 French Army of Africa soldiers refused to surrender and were then shot dead. The fighting in France at the time in the war was intense, but the British and the Allies were being batted back towards the English Channel. They did launch counterattacks against the Germans, but around French towns the fighting was very fierce. The SS Division were told to retreat as they approached towards Dunkirk, and were told to preserve their tanks for the assault on Dunkirk. They were told to let the Luftwaffe attack and engage Allied positions, and near to Bethune there was heavy fighting with the British. The 2nd Battalion of the Royal Norfolks and the 8th Lancashire Fusiliers were holding the Allied line near to Rives de Vinage, Le Paradis and Le Cornet-Malo. Their battalion headquarters had been established at Le Paradis, and they were told to hold out and fight defensively against the Germans to make sure that thousands of members of the British Expeditionary Force could be evacuated by sea from Dunkirk. The SS Division Totenkopf attacked Le Cornet-Malo on the 27th of May, and the British defended well until they were overrun. They did manage to kill a significant number of German soldiers, around 150, and wounded around 500, but then the Germans moved forward to attack Le Paradis. Le Paradis, known as Lestrem, is a small town found around 20 miles west of Lille, and during the First World War it had been completely destroyed, but during the Second World War it would be the site of a horrific massacre. The majority of the British soldiers had fallen back to their headquarters at Cornet Farm, just outside of Le Paradis. The company commanders were told that they were isolated and cut off, and would have to fight out as there would be no assistance sent. They dug in around the farmhouse and prepared for the German assault which would come. The defenders held out against the 14th Company 1st Battalion of the 2nd SS Infantry Regiment until 5:15 in the evening, and had been fighting for a number of hours strongly. They were attacked by mortars, artillery shelling and tanks, with the farmhouse being completely destroyed by the assaults, which forced the British to withdraw to a cowshed. There were many casualties, and as the situation looked dire for the British, the 99 defenders who managed to survive were ordered to surrender by their commander, Major Lyle Ryder. They left the cowshed waving a white flag. The men surrendered not to the Germans they were fighting, but to Fritz Nerklein's unit, who had been fighting nearby against the Royal Scots. Around 20 of the Royal Scots were later found massacred in a separate large-scale execution carried out by Nerklein's SS men. The British who surrendered were a poor state. A number of them had been wounded, but they were then disarmed and were taken down a road off of the Rue de Paradis. They were then told to wait and not move. Whilst they were being gathered, 2 machine guns were being prepared and were set up by a barn in a paddock of a farm. The men had been marched under armed guard by the German soldiers. A survivor's account states, "We halted on the road for 2 or 3 minutes. During this time a German took from my pocket a packet of cigarettes, and when I turned to look at him, he struck me with his rifle, knocking me through the ranks. An unbroken line of German transport was standing on the right-hand side of the road facing us. We were then ordered to march again, and it was at this moment that I saw what had apparently been prepared for us. At the far end of the field opposite the farmhouse I saw 2 machine guns, one of which was already in position, and the other was in the process of being set up. Some distance behind the guns there was a hedge. Standing just inside the gate leading to the field was a group of about a dozen Germans who seemed to be having a discussion. One of the group who I saw close quarters a few minutes later I identified as an officer by the silver cord on his peaked cap. He was about 5 feet 10 inches tall and of slim build, had a dark face with prominent hook nose and dark piercing eyes, and was about 35 to 40 years old. I am inclined to think that this group comprised of officers and NCOs. At this moment, the troops guarding us ordered us to continue the march. At this point we left the road and went through a field through a gate, and I noticed at the foot of the wall of the farmhouse a large hole, which was at least 5 feet deep, 15 to 20 feet long, and 8 feet broad. When the first prisoners reached the far end of the hole, the firing commenced. The men had been marched near to a farmhouse and were machine-gunned as they approached a large pit. Nurkline had ordered his men to continue firing until all of the British POWs had fallen and had been executed. It was said, I was just entering the gate. It seemed that as the men were hit, they fell into the hole. When I reached the hole, the man nearest to me, Private Ward, was hit, and I felt a sharp pain in my left knee and fell into the hole. I fell on top of some men who were already lying there, and others fell on top of me. Firing continued for a few seconds, which time I noticed Major Ryder sitting inside the hole with his back to the side nearest the wall. He seemed to be very badly hit. Groans were coming from the men lying in the hole, and it was at this point that 3 Germans jumped into the hole near Major Ryder, evidently for the purpose of finishing off any prisoners still alive with their bayonets. These Germans climbed out of the hole again, because further shooting started with revolvers and rifles from the edge of the hole. One of the men beneath me moved, and 2 shots were fired into the heap of bodies, both of which hit me in the left leg. At the sound of a whistle, firing ceased, and all the Germans appeared to move away, because I heard no further sound. 97 British prisoners of war had been killed and massacred in a shallow grave that the Germans forced French civilians to bury. Private William O'Callaghan and Private Albert Pooley were the only 2 who survived. The pair wounded managed to hide in a pigsty for 3 days and nights, and they lived on raw potatoes and water from puddles before they were discovered by the farm's owner. They were then cared for by them, and the men were later captured by the German army. A journalist with the Waffen-SS later arrived at the scene after the massacre and wrote, "It was possible to look into the backyard from the road. The corpses in British uniform were lying in the yard near the buildings. They were lying in such a position that one could assume they were killed by machine gun bursts. It struck me at once that the dead soldiers were not wearing helmets, nor did they have any equipment on them. I took pictures of the dead bodies and the whole farm. These were to be placed at the disposal of the division. I believe I was already sitting there in the vehicle when the General told me in the field, from where he had just returned, the equipment taken from the British soldiers was lying in a heap, from which he had come to the conclusion that a summary trial had taken place. The men who survived did arrive back in Britain, being deemed of no use and were repatriated, but they were worried about reprisals. They held the information in of the massacre for a while, and of the 97 killed, only 50 bodies were identified. The bodies were exhumed and reburied in a nearby churchyard. Fritz Nurkline, the commander of the Germans who carried out the shooting, was brought to trial, and he pleaded not guilty of war crimes for the massacre. He would be found guilty of war crimes despite his defence trying to obtain some clemency, and he was sentenced to death and was executed by hanging on the 28th of January 1949 in Hamlin Prison. He was the only German soldier or officer executed and prosecuted for the Paradis Massacre. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.